Good afternoon and welcome to Chats with Jamie. I'm Jamie Franklin, curator at the Bennington Museum, and we've started this series to introduce people in the museum circle to artists who are living and working in our region that have shown at the Bennington Museum or we've worked with in some capacity. And today I am very pleased to welcome Laura Christensen. So welcome, Laura.
Hi.
Hi, Laura, how are you?
Good, thank you. Thank you so much for having me and for doing these chats and all the online content that Bennington Museum is doing. It's really great.
Well, it's really been fun. It's been difficult, but it's always great to be able to respond to challenges with creativity. It's what museums are all about. So, but speaking of creativity, of course, I know you as an artist and as an artist who has a very particular and interesting practice. But maybe before we dive too deeply into your work creating hand-painted vintage photographs, why don't you just give us a little bit of background about how did you come to be an artist and how did you come to this particular practice of hand-painted photographs that you've been working on? I don't know for how long. Why don't you tell me and everybody else?
Okay, well, I always made drawings growing up, but I didn't know what an artist was or that you could be one. And that was a gradual turn and learning experience for me through college, basically. And so I decided I don't want to do all those other possible things. I only wanted to make art, and that's how I became an artist. And I went on to get my Master's of Fine Arts. And I had some old photos just laying around the studio, and I didn't know what to do one day, so I started drawing on them. It was only one step up from like drawing a mustache on a magazine ad. And I had a critique, and I said, "Oh, look at this funny stuff I'm doing," and nobody laughed. And what happened is I began to understand how old photographs come already laden with meaning. Society puts a lot of meaning on them. And so then I began to take it much more seriously, and I started painting instead of drawing. And that was about 20 years ago. And I've been developing the technique ever since.
So you had your first solo show at the museum, or your solo show at the museum back in, I think, 2013. And I think we had maybe known each other for a couple of years since then. And now you've had work in a number of group exhibitions at the museum. The festival is an exhibition in which I, as the curator at the museum, invite artists working and living in the region to respond to particular objects, sometimes more themes, thematic ideas. But why don't we look at the first image? This is actually a hand-painted photograph that, or hand-painted photographs, I should say, that you submitted to our festival exhibition a couple of years ago, in which we invited artists to respond to the work of Grandma Moses. Of course, Grandma Moses being one of the artists that people associate most strongly with the Bennington Museum. And I believe that the title of this piece is Selective Memory. So why don't you tell us a little bit about it? You can see that it's a box, and the image at top and the image on the right are actually things that you can pull out. They're little brass handles that you can pull out. So talk a little bit about these images, about how you go about responding to images as an artist, and just a little bit more generally about your process as we dive into these specific images.
Okay. In some ways, this is an atypical piece for me, but what I really enjoyed about the festival at Bennington Museum is the opportunity to respond to something that already exists, something concrete, in this case, the paintings by Grandma Moses. And in that center piece, surrounded by the field of green velvet, I tried to celebrate some aspects of Grandma Moses's paintings. I painted the hills in the background onto an old photograph of a landscape, and these little characters are specific characters from a variety of Grandma Moses paintings. And it's amazing how in her paintings these little blobs become people with character and gesture. So I really appreciated that But looking back historically at how her work was received, say in the mid 20th century, I felt like it was a grasp culturally for this sort of romanticized version of the world. So her work became so popular, like shortly after we had exploded the first atomic bomb, which is the image in the top. And it's such a terrible thing to think about, that image, and you can't live with that on your mind all the time. So that image, that little panel, when the viewer pulls it up and lets go of it, it can't stay up. It always drops back down. You can pull it up to look at it, but then it drops away. The side panel refers to how there are no references that I know of African Americans in Grandma Moses's paintings. And at the time of her big popularity, African Americans didn't even have the right to vote. So I wanted to point that out, that how they're excluded in a way from this nostalgia version of the world. And so this panel can pull out, and this is an old photograph that I have not altered at all. And I don't know where it's from. Most of the photographs I just scavenged from attics and antique stores. So I don't know who these people are, but now their image is part of this piece and balances some of the images in Grandma Moses.
That's great. And one of the things that I love about your work is this idea. We've invited you to respond, in this case, Grandma Moses, and you'll see a couple of different cases in which I asked you as a curator to respond to specific objects in the Bennington Museum collection. But you've also recently just completed a project, and why don't we pull up the next image, which is the cover of your book, Then Again, in which you invited writers to then respond to your work hand-painted on photographs, in some cases of the pieces that you created for the museum, responding to objects. So it's this complex layering of kind of historical responses or contemporary responses to history, contemporary responses to another contemporary artist's response to history. So I love that kind of referentiality and how it kind of gets layered and piled on top of each other. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about the book and the process as a whole?
Sure. So I was in an exhibit where an author, Hollis Seaman, who's a regional author as well, was invited to write in response to one of my artworks. I didn't know her before that. She wrote this amazing response, which is part of the book, in the book as well. Just a 300-word story. And suddenly I saw, as I think many people did, how her story exists as this cool thing. My artwork exists, but when you put them together, they create this third new thing. And that was really compelling to me, that and being inspired by being part of the festivals and making things in response at Bennington Museum inspired me to go out and ask more authors if they would, and I'm so honored that they did. 31 different authors wrote in response to my work, and it was through Kickstarter that I was able to fund this almost 200-page book on really nice paper, and I thank all the Kickstarter supporters, of which Jamie is one. So thanks for that. And yeah, so it was just a fascinating, amazing journey to invite somebody to write in response to my artwork and then get this gift of meaning and interpretation back.
Yeah, and I think for me, what I love, again, I mentioned the kind of referentiality and the layering, but it's also the idea that, every object or image comes with, every person will respond to it differently based on their own personal backgrounds, their own associations. And this idea that you find these old photographs, which might have had really particular meanings for the people who took them or first owned them, but then you take them out of that context and you put your own response to them, and then we go from there, and it kind of snowballs, which I think is such a beautiful process. Why don't we take a look at the next image? So this is another of the works that you created for our festival. This is in response to what's known as the Memory Tower So this is memory wear was a popular late 19th century Victorian pastime where people would put trinkets and things that they had personal associations with, often on like stoneware jugs. But in this case, Stephen C. Warren, who was a handyman who lived in West Hartford, Vermont, created this amazing spiral tower covered with all these trinkets, and then you responded to it. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this image, the title of which is Forgotten, Remembered, and Imagined, after Stephen C. Warren's Memory Wear Tower.
The memory tower is this great object, and it's kind of big. It's like 4 or 5 feet tall, I think.
Just about 4 feet tall. Yep.
Yeah. And if I could, I would shrink myself down and climb those golden spiral staircases that spirals the tower, and enjoy, you know, really getting into all these little objects. And so I couldn't do that, obviously. So the next best thing was to let the woman in this photograph do it. And so again, I don't know who the woman in the original studio portrait is. Any chains of personal connection that originally existed, like Jamie mentioned, are broken. So that's what allows me, I think, with these photographs to recast the characters in a new story. And so in this one, she's climbing the spiral staircase, or pausing, and the photograph she's holding is a photograph that's on the spiral staircase. When you get a chance to see it, you can look for it. But of course, the little guys come to life and might be on the staircase as well. And so this is in the book, and the author who wrote in response to this is Paul Park, professor at Williams College. And it's a really great response to this, with a fantastical story about what the tower might be and what it's like to live on it.
Yep, and the photo, the person in the tintype, the man that she's holding and peeking out behind her, has turned into her nemesis.
Yes, in the story.
It's a wonderful little short story. So why don't we take a look at this last image next? So this is, I think, the last work that you created for one of our festival exhibitions, and this is a painted photograph that you called Constance Kronoskevitz, and this was in response to an early 19th century musical tall case clock that we have in our collection. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this image and about your kind of dialogue with that clock in our collection?
Sure. The top of the clock in the collection has these kind of loopy ball things that I turned into this kind of felted hat on this woman. And I'm thinking of her as kind of a mistress of time. The second part of the title of the piece is Master of the Meanwhile. And there's also this tradition in 19th century photography for women to like grow their hair super long, like past the length of their feet, and then have that photograph sort of hanging down their back. So when I found this photograph, I don't remember what her hair looked like actually, but it didn't look like this. So I gave her this super long hair that's grown over time. If you look closely, you might be able to see the hourglass that she's holding in her lap. And then the ship in the upper left is just a slight reference to some of the imagery that's on the clock that goes by. There's some kind of reference to a stormy sea and ship.
Yeah, and then as I mentioned, this image, like the last one, is in the book, and in this case, Mary Ruffle, who is actually the current poet laureate of Vermont, is the person who responded to this image, and she wrote this wonderful short story. What is your take on her short story about how the idea of cutting hair and time? It's wonderful and mysterious, just like your images are. I mean, it's hard to describe a narrative because it's a little surreal in the way that it goes about. But what was it like to get these responses to your work? I guess is when you would get these pieces of writing that are direct references to your photographs. What did that make you feel? And like, does it add new significance to your work for you?
Oh, that's a great question. 100%, I was delighted is how I felt when I got stories and poems from people. Because I'm all about the openness of possible meanings in my work. And these stories and poems do that. They open the doors. They rarely close the doors. And Mary Ruefle's in particular is very dreamlike and references dreams and memories and something about like when you're older, looking back to what it was like when you were a child. And does it change what I think about my own work? No, it opens more doors for me as well, because I now, when I see this work, I think of the story in addition to other things I might have been thinking about, such as the grandfather clock. And so, yeah, the opening, the adding of additional meaning and content is really important to me, and I think it's important in society because it helps us see things in new ways, and delight. I'd have to add delight to.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think it's the idea that it's not necessarily a story doesn't close a door, rather it's a cumulative meaning. It's not a sense of finality, but rather like that metaphor that you used of opening more doors. It's you can open up an infinite array of doors, and there's never really any end to the possible meanings you can make out of these artworks, your artworks in particular. But I think it's also something that we can take to viewing art in general, is that everybody can make an infinite amount of meanings out of an individual work of art. As we close out this conversation, I've been asking each artist that I've been chatting with, what have you been up to during this time of pandemic-related social isolation, closures? Has it affected your studio practice? Have you been working on any new projects? What have you been up to?
Like I think a lot of people, it can feel very distracting, and actually seeing these chats with other artists is inspiring. That you're other people are out there working as well. But I do have a project I'm working on, and it follows along in a way because I'm making work in response this time to an entire historic home in New Bedford, Massachusetts. It's called the Roach Jones Duff House, and I'm making an exhibit, some of which will be displayed as a more traditional exhibit, some of it which will be interspersed amongst the museum displays. And all the work I'm making is in response to the home, its history, its collection, and so forth. And that is for the spring of 2021. But it is challenging times in so many ways, and it can be challenging to focus on one's own work when all around the world it seems like so many tragic things are happening. Well, not seems like, so many tragic things are happening, and it's hard to know how to respond. And I feel really lucky and privileged to be able to make my work and be able to get outdoors in the natural world, since we don't live in a city. And so there can sometimes be a little guilt associated with that. But I'm still making my work, because that helps me feel more sane, and that can help me help others as well.
Artists have the ability to bring social ills to the front and make us think about them collectively through time. And so I'm sure that you will continue to make work that challenges us, amuses us, and allows us to think critically about the world around us. So thank you very much for spending some time chatting with me, and hopefully we'll be able to connect in person soon.
I hope so too. Thank you. Be well, everybody, as well as you can.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.